Clerk Segrist could please call the roll.
Trustee Anthony.
Present.
Trustee Foster.
Good evening.
Trustee Graham Hudek. Let the record reflect that Clerk Segrist is in attendance. Treasurer Slavens. Trustee Snyderman.
I'm here.
And Supervisor Williams.
Hello. Okay, I've got one item here that I would like to take care of. Let's see. Adoption of the agenda. Could we have a motion to adopt the agenda as presented?
So moved. Second.
In favor of the motion, please state aye.
Aye.
Motion carries. I've got a recognition that I would like to do very quickly. Not on his radar. So we're going off script here a little bit. We're going off script. To those of you who have worked with Director Foss over the past many years, Tim has been an absolute anchor in Canton Township as Municipal Services Director. Prior to that, he was the guy that brought together and helped us form Watua, which is a wastewater treatment facility. Tim is going into a early quasi-retirement is the best way to put that. And with that being said, I have a resolution that I would like to read. Staff spent some time this morning showering gifts to Tim, showing their appreciation to his service. A lot of it was very creative and funny, and we've got a little going-away luncheon tomorrow as well with this department. But in the meantime, whereas Tim Foss faithfully served the Canton community for 15 years, and whereas under Tim's leadership, the Canton Municipal Services Department achieved many major milestones, a few of which are highlighted below, but are too numerous to list. And whereas, as director, he guided the department through a grueling accreditation process and achieved rare nationally accredited status with the American Public Works Association for Canton Township. And whereas, as director, he led the way the creation of the new water storage facility. And whereas, as director, he provided guidance and leadership for the township's successful bid for the road millage. And whereas, Tim provided a steady hand, rational mind, and kind heart to all that he has worked with. Now, therefore, be it resolved that the Charter Township of Canton Board of Trustees extends its appreciation and congratulations to Tim Foss for his outstanding contribution to the Canton community. His declaration and leadership have been directly impacted the history of Canton Township and influenced the community's long-term direction for years to come. Thank you, sir, for spending the time with us.
Thank you, Pat, and thank you, board and staff. I certainly appreciate the opportunity to have served for Canton. It's been an interesting, a tough at times ride, but we've weathered every storm, including the economic downturn in the mid-2000s, and now, we've seen the community grow back up to, what is an awesome organization to work for, awesome community to be part of. So thank you for taking a chance 22 years ago on the Canadian guy, and I'm glad to have served both W2A and the community, so thanks.
Okay, without further ado, let's move into our study session this evening. Thank you. Yes, Clerk
Mr.
Segrist.
Supervisor, may I read the recognition into public record?
Please do. That's a motion. Could we have that motion supported?
Support.
Those in favor of the motion as presented, please state aye.
Aye.
Motion carries. Thank you very much. Not up front. We're going to do that at the end this evening. Okay. So this evening, while everybody's here in the audience this evening, is the comparison of township and city forms of government. There's been a lot of stuff on social media, a lot of hyperbole, a lot of fear-mongering. Guys, this is nothing other than helping the Board of Trustees and community members who participated in the Roads Task Force to understand township versus a city. What does it mean? That's all we're doing tonight. There's no plans at this point by any board member sitting here that I'm aware of to become a city tomorrow, nor raise taxes tomorrow. But this is something that, as long as I've lived in Canton Township, we're now approaching 100,000 residents, and I have fairly consistently heard from many residents saying, why are we not a city? In fact, most people assume we are a city, so we spend a lot of time correcting them. So in order to help us get through this evening, we've brought in a few subject matter experts. I saw Larry Merrill come in and leave, but okay, I'm going to go ahead and do the introductions real quick. Presenting this evening, we have Wendy Trumbull from Finance, Tim Foss, Director of Municipal Services, Kristen Kolb, Corporate Counsel for Canton Township, as well as Dave Helisek, who's with Plant Moran, who's here to support in terms of any technical questions related to financing. And we have Larry Merrill, who just stepped out, who should be back in a second, as well as Christopher Johnson. Now, Christopher Johnson and Larry Merrill both represent two very significant industry groups in our state of Michigan. One is Chris Johnson, who is with the, he's the general legal counsel for Michigan Municipal League, and I'll share some other background information about who he is, but extremely qualified. Michigan Municipal League is the state of Michigan's body that represents all the cities. In addition to the Michigan Municipal League, we have the Michigan Townships Association, which represents the lion's share majority of all the townships across the state of Michigan. And they're both coming at it from a little bit different perspectives. Mr. Johnson is an attorney by trade, and Larry will correct me if I'm wrong when I go through his introduction, but he's more of a policy guy. So the two main presenters, what I'd like to do is give you a little background on who they are and their qualifications. So we've got Christopher Johnson, serves as the Michigan Municipal League's general counsel. He came to the league from the law firm of Johnson, Rosati, Schultz, and Joppich, where he is a founding partner. For over 30 years, Chris has been active in the defense of municipalities and civil litigation through the state of Michigan. He maintains specialties in the fields of municipal law, school law, legislation, liability, and insurance defense. He is admitted to all state and federal courts in the state of Michigan, as well as United States Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals and the United States Supreme Court. He's a member of the Michigan Association of Chiefs of Police and has served as a member of the state's Michigan Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Commission from 2001 to 2007. He's been an active member of several league legislative committees for many years. In addition, he's served as a general counsel in a number of nonprofit capacities in Michigan. Chris is a seasoned presenter and a graduate of Michigan State University College of Law, formerly Detroit College of Law, and a University of Michigan graduate as well. He served as the mayor of Northville from 1987 to 2015 and was awarded Citizen of the Year by Northville Chamber of Commerce in 2015. He served on the Northville Board of Education from 1976 to 1987, and in 2010 he was named top lawyer by Our Magazine, so apparently he's a pretty good lawyer too. All right, so that being said, also we have with us is Larry Merrill, representing Michigan Townships Association. Under the general direction of Board of Directors, Larry Merrill executes the policies prescribed by the Board of Directors and the association membership, is responsible for the overall operation and administration of the association. Larry's career in township government began at the age of 10, where he helped his father, a DeWitt Township trustee, circulate campaign flyers to support a millage to buy a fire truck. Before he reached the age of 21, Larry served on township volunteer fire departments and chaired the township's Compensation Commission and Planning Commission. He received 2 resolutions of commendation from the DeWitt Charter Township Board for life-saving. While serving in multiple township volunteer capacities, Larry earned his bachelor and master's degree at Michigan State, where studies focused on public administration. While at MSU, Larry was a public policy fellow, named a public policy fellow by the United States Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. Prior to joining MTA, Larry worked at Clinton and Macomb counties performing policy and administrative functions. He also served as a county emergency management director, emergency medical services director. He's also served on Oneida Township Zoning Board during a 7-year stint at Grand Ledge Public Schools, Board of Education. Served as the district's director, board vice president, 3 years as a board. Larry joined the MTA staff in 1980, and it's to coordinate its training programs for Michigan Township News. He's the editor of that. He was promoted to deputy executive director, became MTA's 4th executive director in 2000. So you've been doing that for 18 years now? That's 30 in total, 38, absolutely. Thank you. I served as President of National Center of Small Communities, President of National Association of Towns and Townships. He's also served as a 3-year term of finance. And it goes on, and I'm going to stop there. The point is, these guys are pretty sharp. They've been in government for a long time, helping communities like Canton Township and others across the state just understand how to do things properly, not necessarily to do things. They're not here to promote. There's not a pro and a con. This is not a debate. This is these gentlemen just simply sharing information. That's the goal tonight. So that being said, a little long-winded on the introduction. I'd like to turn it over to you, sir.
Thank you. I'm going to sit so I can be heard. If I stand up and walk around, I lose the microphone, so I will. I'm not being rude. I usually stand when I talk, but then I walk around a lot. One of the things I think that's really important to understand is some of the origins of local government. And local government, be it a township, a city, a village, or one of the other governments like school districts or sanitation districts, we're all creatures of the state. They exist because of state law and they exist because of the state constitution. It's always important to also recognize that local government is constantly evolving and that we're always subject to the agenda of the state legislature. Things change. In lame duck session, as we all know, things are changing as we speak. Local government is also subject to the appellate courts and the interpretations that the courts have. So the Michigan Court of Appeals and the Michigan Supreme Court have a big impact on looking at what the statutes say and then saying what they mean. So the court system also makes a big difference. We start out with the basic unit of government in the state, which is the township, and you're going to hear a lot more from Larry on this point later. But in 1908, a couple years ago, the Constitution really, for the first time, recognized the concept of home rule and local people deciding how local things were going to happen. The current Michigan Constitution is the Constitution of 1963, and in that particular Constitution, they grant home rule status to cities and villages in this state. The supervisor mentioned that we represent cities, but the Michigan Municipal League also represents numerous villages throughout the state of Michigan as well. So those are the incorporated boundaries within the state of Michigan. I'm not going to read this particular section to you, but this is really where home rule exists in the Michigan Constitution of 1963. It very explicitly states that government has the right to have home rule and that it is favored in this Constitution. In Section 34, they also have another section in the Constitution which basically says you should read those particular portions liberally in favor of the local unit of government. So this 1963 Constitution actually went farther than any document Michigan had ever had before in terms of letting local people run their own local affairs. When you talk about a local city charter, it's similar in many respects to a state constitution. The charter becomes the basic document for governing a city. The presentation that I'm going to do today will assume that if you're moving toward a city, you would do it through the Home Rule Cities Act. And I believe that Kristen will be carrying forward some of the actual step-by-step things that you'd have to go through in order to accomplish that, if that is your decision. Now, the Home Rule Cities Act is found at MCL 117.1 and so on. There are several mandatory provisions in the Act that you must include in a city charter. And then there's a lot of permissible items that are you can place in a city charter if that is a desire of the community. It's very, very flexible. Among the mandatory provisions that you would have to have in a charter include the election of a mayor or appointment by the legislative body, the election of the legislative body, the election or appointment of the clerk, treasurer, assessor, or board of assessors, and a board of review. Those are required under the Act. Also, the nomination of elective officers, you can either do it by partisan or nonpartisan primary, petition, or convention. You have to state those desire in the charter itself. And just a quick editorial comment. I don't really know what's partisan about police protection or water or sewer, but that's just my own personal opinion. You also have to include the time, manner, and means of holding elections in the registration of electors subject to the state law. So that's another mandatory provision that's required under the Home Rule statute. Qualifications, duties, compensation of officers, including specifics on the appointment of a chief administrative official, such as a city manager. Finally, the establishment of wards or districts, if there are more than one districts. If you want to divide the community up into specific geographic locations, you can do that through your city charter. Some cities, for example, the city of Northville is only 2 square miles, so there was no need to divide it up into districts. The whole community elects the council at large, but it's your option. Finally, the subjects of taxation for municipal purposes have to be the same for state, county, and school purposes under the general law. So that has to be in the charter. Another mandatory provision is the annual maximum levy that you can have for your charter. It can be up to 20 mils, but it cannot exceed 2% of the total taxable value of the real and personal property in the city. 20 mils is an absolute max. It isn't required to go up that high. You could set the millage rate within that 20 mils at anything in the charter, or leave it up to the city council to make that decision on a year-by-year basis. An annual appropriation of money for municipal purposes. So you are required to have an annual budget. That's another state law as well, but it's also here in the Home Rule Cities Act, so that you are constantly being up on your budget. The handling of state, county, and school taxes is subject to the general laws of the state, but you become, as a city, as you are right now with the township, the main tax collector for everyone that's levying a tax on the property. Another mandatory provision is a public peace and health and safety of persons and property. And the statute contains several options for a city to consider on those particular items. The requirement for adopting city ordinances, including the publication of those ordinances and penalties for violation, also must be in your charter. And then there's also the requirement now to follow the Open Meetings Act and the Freedom of Information Act. Those acts exist not only in their own form as the Open Meetings Act or the Freedom of Information Act, but they also are required to be in your charter as well now. A requirement must be made to keep a journal, and it's very specific that it has to be in English, of all the proceedings of the legislative body. So that's a requirement and a mandatory issue. And then a system of accounts that conforms with the uniform system of accounts as required by law. And I'm sure our friends from Plant Moran can keep us very much informed as to what those would have to be. Now, there's several customary provisions you usually find in a city charter. Those will generally be the name of the city. You can choose anyone that's not taken already. You can keep what you have. Usually you have the power to sue and be sued because it's a corporate body. The power to enter into contracts is a customary provision. The power to acquire and dispose of property, which is an important particular role of government in general so that services can be provided. A requirement for officers to take an oath of office and for surety bonds covering the designated officer. The power of eminent domain is a customary provision you'll see in a charter, and an authorization of a municipal seal. A provision for a vacancy in municipal offices is usually found right in a charter as well, including circumstances under which a municipal officer may be removed by the governing body. You'll also include generally how vacancies are filled right in the charter. So if there happened to be an unfortunate death or something along that line in a community, the city charter should have that in it. Another customary provision in a charter is the boundaries of the city, and then you'll want to make sure that you talk to the Office of the Great Seal and make sure your boundaries that are listed in your charter are consistent with what's on file with the Department of the Secretary of State. And then special meeting requirements and notices of meetings and quorum requirements are also customarily found in the charter. You may, for example, want to have a supermajority for certain kinds of actions. If that was the desire of the Charter Commission, that's a provision that you'd find right there in the charter. Now, there's a lot of permissive provisions in the Home Rule Cities Act, and this is kind of becomes almost I would call it a menu of your possible options. They include water mains, sewers, waterworks, and electric lighting, including plants to generate that, public utilities, public improvement costs and special assessments to pay for those public improvements, a boulevard lighting system, acquisition of private property, which is generally eminent domain, maintenance, development, operation, lease, sale, or disposition of property. Again, this goes back to the municipal function of having services provided to the citizens of the community. Rapid transit is an option. Streets, alleys, and public ways. Parking can be a municipal issue and could be a permissive function in the charter. This particular section on regarding certain trades or occupations or amusements is your authority to generally regulate commerce within the boundaries of the city. The establishment of city departments can be right there in the charter, or they can be a little bit more fluid. Just recognize that schools are not included as a city department. Schools exist as a separate kind of governmental entity, and you don't have control over that. Many mayors throughout the state of Michigan wish they had control of school districts, but they're totally separate. Statement of municipal powers is generally found in the charter as well. What can this city do? Civic, artistic, and cultural activities can also be found in a city charter. In addition to not only setting out what crimes are, you can designate certain items as civil infractions and blight violations so that you can fine rather than simply imprison for violation. You can provide for medical facilities right in your charter. And I guess what this all means is city government in very many respects is very flexible. It can be tailored to suit the needs of this community, the desires of what the citizens of this community want to have, and place it all in the city charter and go forward with that. And other than the mandatory provisions that I talked about and are found in your materials, the community can select the kind of government that it wants. One of the things that you should also be aware of is that you can elect a strong mayor and have a strong mayor that acts as the executive. You can have a what's called a weak mayor, where the manager is the executive and the mayor is really a member of council. Your options are pretty broad in terms of fashioning the kind of government that you want to have. And it's really a local decision right here to be made.
That concludes the presentation, so we'll move over to Larry.
Just wanted to do a couple of quick differences. One of the things that I think is important is administrators do not serve on the governing body in a city. Whether it's a strong mayor situation or whether it's a city manager form of government, the administrators do not sit on the township board. And then cities have control and fiscal responsibilities for their street and road system. There's going to be a little bit more discussion about the financial responsibilities of that later on in the presentation. But right now, you're subject to the whims of the county because the county controls all the roads in a township. You might enter into some agreements with the county in terms of funding them and literally begging them to come out and plow a street or something along that line. But cities have the control of the road system, the locals and major streets, as well as a financial responsibility for that.
Thank you, Chris. Larry?
Well, let's see, how do I get to my program? Is it,
Tim will set you up.
right, I'll wait. That looks familiar. Great, thanks. Thank you, Mr. Supervisor. Thanks, Chris, nice. I expected a very thorough presentation, and I also want to say hello to everyone in the audience and express my appreciation for your interest in civic engagement, including a Boy Scout. Nice to have you with us tonight. So when I usually do a presentation to the public about the differences between cities and townships, one analogy I make is that oftentimes when people get ill, they go to their doctor. Their doctor might be a medical doctor, or their doctor might be an osteopath. Most people don't really know what the difference is. As long as they get well, as long as they're treated properly, as long as they like that person and trust them, that's really all that matters. But then when you drill down a little deeper, you might find that a medical doctor tends to rely more on their training to deal with medical illnesses and disease with medicine, internal medicine. Osteopaths are trained to do more manual manipulation, look at the body more holistically. Neither one, I think, would say one is the best way or the right way or the wrong way. It's a matter of preference. And to a certain degree, I think the differences between townships and cities sort of reflect that same. It's more a matter of culture and philosophy as opposed to a radical difference in the delivery of programs and services. Now, Chris did such a nice, thorough job of explaining what a city charter looks like. I think that saves me from having to explain what a township is, and especially assuming that most of you are residents of Canton Charter Township, you already know what a township is, but perhaps what I can do is play off some of Chris's observations and maybe make a few distinctions about how this plays out a little bit differently in a township. With the objective is really, there's a serious policy issue here that for many people, they won't matter to them in the short term. Daily services will continue, but in the long term has a significant impact on the culture, tradition, scope of programs and services, and the taxation rate that they may experience in their local government. So my focus here is really going to be mostly on those issues that people would consider, is it appropriate that Canton operate and be governed as a city or as a township. So digging in found some old maps. I mean, basically, most of Wayne County used to be all townships with the exception of a very small municipality called the City of Detroit. The rest were 16 townships. Now there's 8, and I'd like to talk a little bit about the traditions and history of how Wayne County has evolved the form of government it is and where Canton's place is in it. In contrast to a city charter, the townships, especially with the Charter Township Act, the state law is the charter. So I'm going to really contrast just a very few of the major issues of where townships differ from cities compared to the presentation that Chris made. So in a city, you have a commission, a charter commission, drafts a proposed charter, and then it is put to a vote to be ratified or rejected by the voters. On the other hand, virtually everything that Chris talked about as matters for the city charter are addressed in state law. So the question first becomes, is the statutory scheme for a charter township working for us? Or is it even preferable? Or do we want more flexibility that a city charter might provide for us? In terms of services, if you had followed me from Lansing down here, you would have passed state police, you would have passed county sheriffs, you would have seen the Livonia police pull somebody over, you have Canton Public Safety, and for most people, whether it's police, fire, the services seem to be offered, and it's really the difference is the color of the cars, the vehicles, and the name on the side. If this was wintertime and it was snowing, you might see MDOT plows, you might see Wayne County Department of Public Works, their road department plowing. You'd see Livonia plowing their roads and kind of see that all of this somehow manages to get done. The services that are provided for in a city, of course, with home rule, is very broad. It's intended to give cities virtual authority to do anything that serves a valid public purpose that's not prohibited by by some state law. On the other hand, with townships, our form of government is all statutory. So there has to be a statute that either fairly implies or explicitly authorizes a service to be provided. Now, Chris mentioned in the Constitution the liberal powers doctrine, which is really kind of important because up until the 1962 Constitution, townships really were very hamstrung by having to look for a statute that expressly authorized them to do something, and the legislature tended to be very explicit as to how the townships were to perform. So today, with liberal powers, as long as something is fairly implied, we have a lot of flexibility to do those things as well. But we don't have the scope of discretion that cities have. When I say we, I'm talking about townships. Now, this could be a good thing or a bad thing. If you're a person who believes that government should be relatively small and confined to basic services, townships work pretty well. If you are a person that believes that a local government should be expansive into areas, social services, welfare services, and things like that townships don't have express statutory authority for, could be a factor in terms of deciding which area, which type of government works for you the most. Now, road authority, I believe, is from conversations that I've had with Pat and others, I believe that it is consideration of the relationship between Canton Township and Wayne County regarding roads is maybe a strong issue at hand here. So regarding a city, if you become a city, the county can relinquish jurisdiction over their primary and local roads to the municipality. Oftentimes happens. Sometimes the counties retain authority over certain roads. Now, the nice thing about that, the plus and maybe what's attractive, is that every time you buy gasoline, you pay a substantial tax that is collected by the state. And in addition, when you register your vehicles, you pay a very handsome registration fee as well. That money is also collected by the state. It is redistributed with 39.1%, or 39.1% that goes to Michigan Department of Transportation. The same amount is divided to the 83 counties, and then the cities receive 24.8% of that formula. So, am I right on my numbers? Pretty close. What's that? 21.8. I transformed them. So, Consequently, there's a formula then that further divides how that money is to be spent regarding how much goes to primary roads, how much goes to local roads. It's given on urban roads, population, very complicated formula, and I understand the Canton staff have done some really strong work on trying to calculate what that impact would be for you guys. So for the townships, on the other hand, since 1931, all non-state roads in a township is under the jurisdiction of the county road department. Now, there was some mention that there is statutory authority for a township to contract to do some of that work themselves and receive a portion of that PA 51 money for that. But most townships have really not opted to do that, but it is an option for you. So part of the decision is, okay, how would that look? Chris mentioned that you're under, what was the term you used? Under the whim, I think, of the county, which is, can be frustrating if you are, have your own vision of how roads are to be maintained and improved and taken care of. The county, of course, has to balance your interests as well as all of the other townships as well. So then the question becomes, all right, how much money would we get under PA 51 if we became a city, and how much money would it cost us to actually take care of the roads? We had a symposium actually about a year ago where we were looking at the decision of townships taking over roads. Most, if not everybody in the room, decided they didn't want them because essentially our road funding system is broken. And to take over a broken road system underfunded by the state means you got to calculate how much local money would be put in, which you guys are already doing as well, already under the current system. So what's the condition of the roads? What would it take to get them up to the condition that we'd want them to, and then maintain them as part of the decision that's facing you? In terms of the government structure, this is really inside baseball stuff. I don't, the public doesn't necessarily pay an awful lot of attention to this, but for those of us who work with township boards, this is very critical. So in the government structure in a city, generally the mayor is the strongest part of that three-part legislative branch, executive branch, and the judicial, which plays a pretty small role at the local level. So strong mayors, weak mayors, city managers, they are all, especially a manager or a strong mayor, have an awful lot of power in day-to-day. And the biggest thing, they have veto power over, mayors generally do, over their legislative bodies. In a township, we have a pretty unique system here. We really don't have an executive branch. The supervisor is described as the executive of the board, but not the executive of the township. So I like to describe township government structure as a government of consensus. There really is no veto power that a supervisor can exercise. The supervisor in a charter township has explicit day-to-day administrative authority, but it is somewhat subject to the township board's oversight. The township board can adopt policies that constrain or put parameters on that supervisor's day-to-day authority. So much of what the supervisor does has to be consent of the township board. The board, the supervisors, they have to work together. There has to be a general agreement on a lot of things that that when you have a division of powers tend to be issues of contention. So in a township, the township board really is the highest authority, and that generally brings a lot of viewpoints to the table. Clerks and treasurers also serve on the township board. They can be elected positions in a city if the charter provides for it, but in townships they are automatically elected, and they're also elected members of the 7-member township board. It arguably clouds the division between administration and executive, but on the other hand, it brings financial expertise to the township board. It brings perspective of what the internal operations are affected by policy. So it does have, I think, some advantages under some circumstances as well. And for purposes of the judiciary, we'll leave that alone because district courts and how that all works, it's pretty much the same whether you're a city or a township. The issue of taxation that Chris alluded to. As he said, 20 mills is the limitation in state law for cities. They also have income tax authority. In charter townships, that limitation is 10 mills. It can be levied 5 mills without voter approval. The additional 5 mills have to be levied with voter approval. And with just a very, very few exceptions that apply to both cities and townships, that 10 mills cannot be violated. So there is a bit more control, in fact, there's considerably more control over local taxation here. And the townships have no authority to levy income taxes, of which I think 23 cities do, if I remember right. So here's sort of I've just summarized them in terms of the charter, the services, road authority, government structure, taxation, I think are the primary differences that you'd have to deal with. Now, before I close, let me wrap up a little bit about, so why do we have 1,240 townships and 270 cities?
About 500.
No, cities and villages.
Village, yeah.
Yeah, so I think it's about 270 cities and almost the same number of villages in Michigan. So here's one of those famous old maps with just a very small portion back. I don't know exactly when this is dated, but this is really when we had one municipality and virtually all were townships. So this has evolved over time into quite a patchwork of local governments. I think I read somewhere there's 150 some taxing jurisdictions in Wayne County alone. There are 8 townships, and the way that, when you look in southeast Michigan, we're pretty well divided with the yellow units around. Those are general law townships. The blue ones are the charter townships. The green are those that have a manager form of government in a city. The blue are the strong mayor form of governments, and then a few in this area that under gold that are villages. So there's Canton, just to give you some perspective on that. So when you look at it this way, Canton is a charter township in southeast Michigan, is certainly not an outlier in the form of government that it has. But if you focus really on Wayne County alone, you see that, well, that strong mayor form of government really does dominate, especially a lot of the older cities in Wayne County. The manager form of government is somewhat of a minority in Wayne County. Now, at one time, we had 1,267 townships. That was up until about 1850, after the Civil War, and then into the very early part of 1901. Then you can see that it's really stayed relatively the same. From 1,267, we dropped to 1,260 in 1940, 1,245 in 1970, and then stayed relatively that same number ever since. To zero in, we've really only lost, in the way MTA would look at it, between 1901 and today, only 27 townships out of 1,267 have either been totally annexed, become split up into parts of a city, or they were incorporated, like what is before you today, incorporated whole into cities. So looking at that a little bit more closely, there was somewhat of a small drop between 1901 and 1945 after World War II. From World War II to 1978 was the biggest drop, from 1,260 townships down to 1,245, and then stayed relatively the same since then. So here's what has driven most of the decisions in the history of Michigan, why townships have ceased to exist or become cities. So for the most part, the reason why we lost some of these townships around the turn of the century was we had a substantial migration from the farm to the city. So in terms of that migration, townships just at that point in time were not in any sort of position to provide urban-type services, water, sewer, police, fire. Townships were really limited mostly on basic services. Plus, because our road system was so terrible, people really wanted to live in close proximity to their jobs. They didn't have the luxury of commuting 45 minutes or an hour on nice highways or even crowded highways. They really had no option but to live within walking distance of the factories where they were going to live. So cities became very heavily populated. After World War II, things got really interesting because as we had a lot of pent-up demand after the Depression, the post-war expansion, the so-called baby boomers that produced me and many of the people in this room. That's when the Charter Township Act was adopted in 1947, recognizing that we needed an option in Michigan where areas that were growing in population needed to provide urban-type services, needed somewhat of a hybrid form of government between city and township form of government. So during that period, this is when we had the highway expansion, this is subdivisions, and what really drove much of the departure of townships into cityhood was the issue of annexation. So annexation power authority from World War II until the 1960s was what we would categorize as being very liberal towards the cities. Essentially, if the cities wanted to take a portion of a township, they could have it. And it was a way that they developed more revenues. If the township began to develop, they wanted some of that tax base, they could claim it. As the populations grew and we had revenue sharing that was based on population, it became very attractive for cities to try to annex portions of townships. This was very common and it was very divisive. In fact, we had a Plymouth and Northville Township and Livonia still had somewhat of a contentious annexation issue a few years ago. So now we have a very stable period of time. So since 1978, we've had virtually no townships. The last one started in 78 and actually incorporated in 83 or 84. We've really had very few townships that have really changed from township to city. The last time I did a presentation like this was to West Bloomfield, and I think it was somewhere in the 1980s or so. And, sir? Redford's a township. There is no city of Redford. So your neighbor, what's that? That's right. So a portion, right. So a portion of Plymouth, the center, incorporated as the city of Plymouth, a portion of Northville Township incorporated as the city of Northville.
Pardon me, sir. There'll be opportunity for public comment. Let's get.
I appreciate your enthusiasm,
Yeah,
however.
we have multiple presentations we want to get through, so there's a lot of information coming at you. We'll get some questions at the
I
end.
love the questions, though. Sorry about that.
problem.
So I still want to sneak in an answer for you. There's not a lot, there aren't a lot of, that's not a hugely common situation where they have the same name, but it is very common to have Mount Clemens, for example, surrounded by Clinton Township. So Romeo, the village of Romeo, are surrounded by Bruce Township. What's that? And Lake Orion, the village of Lake Orion. Yeah, so there are examples of that that's quite common. Originally, often villages that were created as sort of special taxing units where there was a high density and then the rest of the township remaining rural and under the township form. But as Chris mentioned, townships got liberal powers in the Constitution. The annexation has sort of fallen out of favor. Most cities don't aggressively go after annexation of townships anymore. Oftentimes, it generates more cost to them than it does in terms of tax revenue, especially if it's mostly residential. So that strategy is somewhat declined. We also have what's called Public Act 425, annexations by agreement, which more units of government have favored to try to resolve these boundary issues instead of adversarial. So we have this Charter Township Act, and this is what you're operating under right now. So essentially what we would represent as its strong suits is that it provides pretty broad powers to do most, if not all, the things that most communities want to do. Consensus-driven decision-making. It allows certainly for the election or appointment of professional management. The taxation rates tend to be more in line with people's favoritism of limited government. And the charter townships do have some annexation protections today. So in terms of the differences, most of the time we work through regional collaboration. We have joint service agreements. This is how communities work together instead of doing things through annexation. Now, one of the things that has been mentioned to me is that people in Canton Township are surprised that you are a township. Well, what does a township look like? Well, Townships look like this, or at least their municipal building looks something like this. They're modern, they're effective, they're the type of units that most people would be proud to live with. And in terms of how they brand themselves, they are very proud to be townships, and there's Redford Township's municipal sign as well. So this is how, in many areas, townships have a certain cachet. They're the communities that you really want to live in. And how they represent themselves are Shelby Township, Clinton Township, Waterford Township. But it doesn't surprise me that people are puzzled by what they live in Canton, because Canton is a community. And that's how Canton has branded itself. So if the form of government is an issue, you know, that's somewhat is what you call yourself and how you represent yourself to the public. So Canton Community has a really nice website. It references Canton as a community, and there's a lot of good information on there. There's also information on their website about some of the things that I have talked about here. But I would contrast it, this is Shelby Townships. They are the second largest township in Michigan, and how they represent themselves. They really are quite proud of being a township, and they really focus on townships being efficient, effective, and accountable, accessible form of government. This is how things shape out in terms of what your cohorts are. If Canton was a city, you would be the 8th, 9th.
11th.
You would be the 10th largest city in Michigan, second only to Westland, or to Livonia, which is 96,000 Westland, and then Canton Township would be 90,000 right under them. So you'd be about the 9th largest, 8th, 9th, 10th largest city. You're the second largest township here in Michigan, and to compare with some of the other townships that are also of large size here. So I'll wrap up to just say this. This is really what your community's values, your expectations are, the culture. I think that ultimately that's what boils down if this issue were ever to go to the ballot. And I'll stop there.
Good, thank you. Very thorough, both gentlemen. Kristen, in terms of process, what is the process?
All right, so I'm going to talk about the actual process. What would have to happen for Canton to change from a charter township to a city? There are two acts that would govern the incorporation of Canton as a city. One is the State Boundary Commission Act, and the other is the Home Rule Cities Act, which you heard, I think, Chris talk about in pretty great detail. They work together. But the State Boundary Commission Act is very clear that if there's any conflicts between the two acts, then the State Boundary Commission Act would control. And as Larry talked about, Canton is a charter township, which means that our township is the state law. It is the Charter Township Act, which is found in the state law at MCL 42.1. So our charter is spelled out and decided on by the state legislature as opposed to the local legislature. So the State Boundary Commission is a 3-member body. All the members are appointed by the governor, and they administer the State Boundary Commission Act and parts of the Home Rule Cities Act and the Home Rule Village Act, particularly as it relates to the incorporation process. But the State Boundary Commission Act also deals with annexation that Larry mentioned, and it would also deal with a situation where multiple municipalities would want to consolidate into one. The State Boundary Commission has adopted rules, administrative rules, so between the act in the legislature and the administrative rules, they do govern the process. So I know there's been a lot of discussion about how Canton would go, and is the board going to go in this direction to become a city? The board has no control over that. The process for a township or a village under state law to become a city is initiated by a petition signed by the residents. And the petition actually, or the process actually starts under the State Boundary Commission Act, with the filing of a petition that is signed by at least 5% of the qualified residents who live in the area proposed to be incorporated. Now, the reason it's worded that way is because, like Larry talked about, you have the city of Northville. Well, the entire township of Northville did not incorporate as a city. Only a small center around sort of the downtown did. So assuming something like that were to happen in Canton, where only a finite area of the township wanted to incorporate, you would need 5% of the residents that live within that area would have to sign that petition. The petition must also include that area, and it could be the 36 square miles that currently constitute Canton Township, or it could be something less. The petition must also set forth the reason for the incorporation request. It must also be certified that it meets the population and density requirements that is set forth in the Home Rule Cities Act, and it must request the incorporation of the territory being proposed as a home rule city. That has to be specifically stated. The people that sign the petition for incorporation must be qualified electors, and they must be freeholders residing in that territory. So this first petition is filed directly with the State Boundary Commission, who then notifies the local clerk and the county clerk that a petition for incorporation has been filed. The SBC, State Boundary Commission, then performs a review of the petition to make sure it meets all those requirements I mentioned in the previous slide, and to make sure it complies with any of its administrative rules that govern the petition itself. If upon review, the State Boundary Commission finds that the petition does not meet the requirements, it is sent back to the circulator. If it does meet the requirements of the act and the rules, it's scheduled for a public hearing. The public hearing takes place at a convenient location within the area to be incorporated, and it must occur no sooner than 60 days after receipt of the petition, but not later than 220 days after the receipt of the petition. They must give notice in a paper of general circulation at least 7 days prior to the hearing, and it must be, notice of the hearing must also be published in 10 public locations, at least 10 places in the township, at least 10 days prior to the hearing. No, I'm sorry, that's the wrong, there's a hearing later. Notice of the hearing must be published in a newspaper of general circulation at least 7 days prior to the hearing, and notice by certified mail of the hearing must be given to the local clerk and the county clerk. So once the State Boundary Commission schedules a public hearing, the sufficiency and legality of the petition can no longer be challenged. In other words, once they've decided it meets the requirements of the act, that train has left the station and the process moves ahead. At the hearing, the public hearing on the petition, the State Boundary Commission will consider the following: the population density, the land area and the land values, the assessed valuation of the property proposed for incorporation, the topography, natural boundaries, and drainage basins, and this is all directly from the statute. Past and probable future urban growth, including population growth, business, commercial, and industrial development, the need for community services, future needs for services, the practicability of the proposed city supplying those services, and a bunch of other things that relate to the ability of this entity to function as a city. Will they have sufficient tax base? Do they have the ability to provide police and fire? Do they have the ability to maintain the roads? All those things will be evaluated by the State Boundary Commission before they decide whether the process moves ahead. Following the public hearing, the State Boundary Commission decides whether the petition is going to proceed or whether they are going to deny it and the process ends. If they deny the petition, the process is over. It can only be restarted through the filing of a different petition at some point down the future. If they approve the petition, then it moves ahead for the completion of the process for the township to become a city. They also have the ability to say, we don't think the full 36 square miles of Canton Township should be a city. We're going to carve out a smaller area so they can actually modify the boundaries of the proposed city and then move ahead with that. So there's three options. They deny, they approve, or they approve with boundary changes. If they approve, whether as proposed or as modified, that order would become final within 45 days after it's certified, unless a petition for referendum is received by the State Boundary Commission. So at this point, there's a second possibility of a referendum, and then the question of whether to incorporate as a city comes back to the people. A ballot question would be placed on the ballot. Shall Canton Township incorporate as a home rule city? Simple yes or no. So if that happens, if a petition is received for a referendum, again, it gets analyzed for all the legal requirements. If they certify it as being proper, it gets kicked back to the local clerk, who then schedules an election on the question of incorporation. So at that point, it gets sent again for a vote. If the petition for referendum is voted down, again, the process ends right there, and the question of incorporation is dead. If it is passed by the residents, then you move on to the election of a charter commission. Now, the charter commission, again, is the members of the commission are determined, again, by another election. So individuals who would be interested in serving on the Charter Commission have to submit a petition signed by 20 qualified electors from the proposed incorporated area. You can have more than 9 people put their name in for this position, but the top 9 vote getters would constitute the Charter Commission. And again, there's a requirement for publication of notice, and this is the 10-day notice of that election is posted in 10 places, at least 10 days prior to the election. If there are more than 9 candidates for the Charter Commission, the top 9 vote getters constitute the commission. Once that election is complete, the members who have won a seat on the Charter Commission are notified, and they are required to convene, I think it's the second Tuesday after the election. So the 9 charter commissioners then come together to begin the very difficult process of drafting the charter for the new city. The Charter Commission is a public body. It's subject to the Open Meetings Act. Their public records would be subject to the Freedom of Information Act. They have to hold public meetings open to members of the public. And just like any other elected or appointed body in a local government, they have to take an oath of office. They have to elect from amongst themselves officers. They have to determine their rules of parliamentary procedure. They have to keep minutes. And they have the task of fixing the date of what would become the first city charter and an election on that charter. Charter commissioners that are elected serve a one-time 3-year term, and that is a finite deadline for presenting proposed charters back to the residents of the area for them to vote on a proposed charter. Now, the state law says they have to draft a charter within 90 days. I would be willing to bet that in the history of the state of Michigan that no proposed city has ever drafted and finalized a charter within 90 days. There's just too many variables, as Chris laid out. There's the permissible provisions, there's the mandatory provisions, there's also prohibited provisions that he did not talk about. But the state law specifically says you cannot have these things in your charter. The discussion of whether to be a strong mayor, weak mayor, city manager form of government elicits a lot of discussion because it really fundamentally shapes how your local unit of government is going to operate from here until potentially the charter is amended, which is a very difficult task. I'm not going to go through the list again because Chris did a good job of laying out all those different mandatory, permissive, and customary provisions, but I mean, he just gave the highlights. There's a lot more to it than just those sort of one-line summaries of what each of those different things might be.
I think that's a pretty good summary.
Yeah.
It's a long, drawn-out process, has to go in front of the vote of the people on 3 different occasions. You have to have the front to even get the bus rolling. So
Yep.
it's
And then,
a
so then once,
cumbersome process.
yeah, once the Charter Commission comes up with a draft that they are satisfied with, it then goes to the governor. The governor has the opportunity then to review it, and typically what happens is they will send it to the Attorney General's office for review by their finance division. Sometimes charter commissions come up with alternate proposals that they can't decide on, so they say, we're going to let the people vote on these. So the Attorney General's office would have to review and approve any alternate proposals as well. During that process of review by the Attorney General's office, they may have questions. They are permitted to communicate with the secretary or clerk of the Charter Commission. There could be some back and forth, some clarifications. So there's an open line of communication and dialogue so that everybody's clear on exactly what is going to be put in front of the voters. So at the end of that, the Attorney General's office communicates its approval or disapproval to both the governor and the clerk or secretary of the Charter Commission. The governor then makes his formal determination on whether the proposed charter is appropriate or not. The governor can send its approval back to the Charter Commission, or it could say, I disapprove of this, and the governor must set forth the reasons why they disapprove with the proposed charter. So assuming the governor approves it, it gets sent back to the Charter Commission. They then submit the question of, shall this charter be elected to the voter? So we're up to our third election on the question of becoming a city. The first time the charter goes to a vote of the people, it should also include potential candidates for whatever city offices have been determined to be elected. It should be the mayor for sure, but it could also be a clerk position that's elected. I remember almost 20 years ago, I worked for the city of Westland, and at that point, their clerk was hired by the mayor. Well, there was a big dispute over the firing of the clerk, and ultimately they amended their charter to make the clerk an elected position. So I think a lot of communities are going that route because it takes the sort of personal political side out of it and makes it a decision of the people. So the charter will go for election along with whatever offices, again, are decided to be elected positions. If the charter is voted down, the people who have otherwise won those city offices, those elections are void, except for the top vote getter. Whoever the top vote getter for a city office becomes the de facto mayor to sort of guide the community through the process of finally, hopefully, getting a charter adopted and into cityhood. The Charter Commission can submit 3 different charters to the people for a vote, and it must be done within 3 years. So if we get to the end of 3 years and no charter's been adopted, the process ends and the community reverts to a township. The incorporation process is over. And if someone's still interested in trying to make the community a city, they have to start back at the very beginning. Assuming a charter is approved by the residents, it is the election certified, that charter gets sent to the Secretary of State, and on that date, it's filed with the Secretary of State is the date the community finally officially becomes a city. So while there's some deadlines written into it, I think Larry had mentioned there was a community that took approximately 5 years to actually go from a township to a city. So while this is a summary that I just did in 12 pages, I don't think it even begins to represent the amount of work and the possible time that that it can take to go through this process.
Tim and Wendy, you're going to take us home with financial impacts?
Correct. Just while I'm getting this up here, if anybody didn't get a handout tonight, we made about 50 copies. You can contact the Township Supervisor's office after the meeting, and they can get you a copy of the presentations. So now that you've heard the kind of administrative, the kind kind of jurisdictional, I guess, and legal aspects of the differences between township and city. Wendy and I are going to cover some of the financial impacts. I'm going to talk specifically about the road funding estimates. Two areas of discussion. First, the revenues that the township would receive as a city under Michigan's Public Act 51. That's the public act that governs road funding in the state of Michigan, and something that's called the Michigan Transportation Fund. And then secondly, I'll talk about some expenses that I had worked on earlier this year for the Roads Task Force relative to setting up a road maintenance section in our Public Works Division of Municipal Services. And then at the end, Wendy's going to talk about some of the other revenue impacts of part of all of this discussion. So first up, the Public Act 51 revenues and expenses. The first thing to understand about taking over roads from Wayne County is there's a lengthy process that would be involved in order to transfer the jurisdiction over the public roads in Canton between the County Department of Public Services and Canton Township. That is, that's going to be certainly a difficult process in order to sort out which roads would remain with Wayne County and which would become part of a city. But ultimately, MDOT approves that jurisdictional transfer after the two parties have come to some successful negotiation, and then they certify that transfer of jurisdiction under Public Act 51. For the purposes of the analysis that's being presented today on cost and on revenue, I had to make a number of assumptions. They're the same assumptions that were in our financial model from March of 2018 that was presented to the Roads Task Force. And the two key assumptions are really the length of roads, the major roads that Wayne County would likely retain under its jurisdiction, and the length of local roads that Wayne County would retain. In the prior case, the major roads, if you think of roads like Cherry Hill Road through the city of Westland, Westland is a city, Cherry Hill Road is under the jurisdiction of Wayne County. So think kind of the major roads in the community in all probability would remain county roads. And we might get some of those roads through this negotiation process, but likely the majority of those roads would remain with Wayne County. And then we would probably get most of the local roads. Out of the 410 miles of roads in Canton Township, 267 miles roughly of those roads are county roads. 58.77 are the major roads, and 208 miles are the local county roads. And I put in notes here, those are mostly subdivision streets, although there are some, what I would define as secondary roads in the community, like Hanford is a good example, that are not truly a subdivision road, but they're categorized by the state and the county as an actual local road. So for the purposes of running the math out, especially on the revenue side, I had to make some assumptions. The first was that operationally, at the end of the day, we would negotiate the receipt of 2 miles, roughly, of major county roads, and I'll show you those on a map in a second. Those would become roads of the city, and then we would receive all or 100% of the local county roads. Those are mostly subdivision roads, would also become roads of the city. This is probably the most important bullet in this entire presentation, and that is that changing these two assumptions, the length of major roads and the length of the local roads that would be effectuated by this transfer, would have a dramatic change in the road funding estimates. So that's one thing that has staff a little nervous with the numbers, because this negotiation hasn't happened, it hasn't commenced, and until it commences, you're not going to have an absolute defined revenue or expenditure side in our financials. So caution is needed in understanding these numbers going forward. The only accurate way, as I mentioned, is to actually conduct the negotiation and then have MDOT actually certify the transfer of jurisdiction between the county and the future city. Albeit a little bit blurry, this is the actual certification map that the county has on file with the state of Michigan. I've color-coded it to represent a few things here. If you take a look at the main screen above the board, you can see there's a number of roads here that are highlighted in pink that are both east-west roads and north-south roads. The assumption in this analysis is that everything that is shown in pink would remain Wayne County roads. So not looking at every one of these, but kind of specifically looking at the top here, from our border with the city of Westland, westerly along Joy Road, out here to Beck, that would remain a county road. The section west of that, which is highlighted green, which the majority of it is a gravel road, would become a city road. Part of it is local, and part of it is a major gravel road, which kind of further complicates things a little bit. But if you generally look at the map and think the pink roads are going to be roads, again, Warren is very similar. Cherry Hill is very similar all the way across the community. Most of it would likely be retained by Wayne County. Anything in green is a local road. A good example is this section of Green Road right here. This is Lots. So Lots from Warren south to Ford Road, this little kind of less than half-mile section, is actually a major road. However, all of the section south of Ford Road to our community boundary at the south end is actually a local road. So my assumption is that this little piece of road north of Ford on Lots would be one of the sections that would be transferred jurisdictionally from Wayne County to Canton Township, and that's just based on winter maintenance routes and how those roads would be plowed by the two different entities. So we made some conscious operational decisions about what roads we would probably get and what roads we would not, but as I mentioned, until we actually conducted those negotiations, we wouldn't know exactly. The road maintenance and repair funding flows into the Michigan Transportation Fund under Public Act 51, as Chris had mentioned, and it is derived from three main sources of revenue. Those sources of revenue are the state fuel tax. As you know, in 2015, the legislature voted to increase the state fuel taxes now to 26 cents per gallon for both diesel and for regular gasoline. State vehicle registration fees is the second source of revenue into the transportation fund. That varies based on the type of vehicle, paid annually with your license renewal with the Secretary of State. I noted here in my case, my pickup truck is $142 is what I pay for annual registration. There was a substantial increase in 2015 in your vehicle registrations in order to put more money into roads for Act 51. And then the third piece of the pie that the legislature put into Act 51 are ratcheting up appropriations from the state taxes that are collected each year. In the current state fiscal year, which just started, the state is appropriating $150 million into the $2.5 billion Michigan Transportation Fund. So it gives you kind of a scope of how much additional money is going into roads in this current fiscal year. Next year, that money ratchets up to $325 million, and then in the third year, it ratchets up to $600 million, and that $600 million is in place each and every year thereafter. So these are kind of the three main sources of revenue that create the Michigan Transportation Fund. And then, as was mentioned earlier, 39.1% of that goes to the state, 39.1% goes to the counties, and 21.8% is distributed to all the cities and villages in the state of Michigan. It's a fixed formula. There's actually a worksheet that you can download off the state's website, and you can see exactly in these years that I've identified the actual funding amounts that go towards the population of the community. is factored into that worksheet. The miles of major road, again, think Joy, Cherry Hill, Warren, those sorts of roads. Trunk line roads, which in all likelihood we would not receive any trunk line roads. Michigan and Ford are a couple examples of those, but those are state roads. Those are not county roads, so they would not be part of a city road network. Unless MDOT so chose to transfer jurisdiction, which is fairly unlikely, in my opinion. And then the last part is the miles of local road. The important distinction here is that the funding calculation that goes towards major roads and local roads is substantially different. Major roads are funded at $12,998 per mile for this current fiscal year. And that's a mile regardless of the number of lanes there are in that road. And the local roads are funded at $3,427 per mile. So the state has recognized through Public Act 51 that major roads generally are wider, maybe a little bit thicker cross-section, maybe a little bit different design than local roads, and as a result, should receive an additional funding amount. You could argue whether those amounts are fair, and there's certainly been a lot of debate by municipalities for decades about the fairness of Act 51 and whether or not it's appropriate. But we use the state's numbers in order to, or I use the state's numbers in order to run the revenue. As I mentioned, there's a specific revenue assigned to each one of these line items, and the sum of the lines in the worksheet total the amount of revenue that you would actually receive from Act 51. What Act 51 covers, primarily it covers summer and winter maintenance, and I've listed everything here from pothole patching, crack sealing, concrete and asphalt repairs, grading, catch basins, storm sewers. You can see the long list of items. And then winter maintenance, it includes plowing, salting, de-icing, and other winter maintenance activities on these roads. It also provides a source of funding for what's called local match. So if you think of the Westland example that I gave you, Cherry Hill Road, when the county needs to make a major rehabilitation or replacement of Cherry Hill Road in Westland, the county comes to the city of Westland for a match towards that project. That project would likely receive some federal aid, some federal money from the federal fuel taxes for its reconstruction, but the county looks to the city to provide some of the local match towards county projects. Funding for the local match comes from out of Act 51 for city road reconstruction projects. Those would be the 2 miles of major roads and 208 miles of local roads that I mentioned. However, there are some restrictions on that under Act 51. And then there's some minimal funding for other city road reconstruction projects, and these are generally kind of more restrictive for subdivision roads and some of the other minor roads in the community. Again, maybe the second key point of this presentation is that Public Act 51 funds are generally not sufficient for extensive city road reconstruction costs. Many of the communities that we spoke with over the past year, and I think this is kind of generally known throughout the state, that Public Act 51 in itself doesn't raise enough money to repair a community's roads. We have the luxury as a township to have the 1.45 mills that were approved by the voters back in August, and that will certainly go a long ways to help reconstruct and make major repairs to the roads over the next 20 years. But communities that don't have a special millage for roads struggle substantially with funding road maintenance activities. You look to the communities that we spoke with were the city of Novi, the city of Farmington Hills, and the city of Livonia as kind of 3 of our closest and some of our comparator communities that we often benchmark services against. Each one of those communities have specific additional millages for road improvements. And Farmington Hills at the kind of extreme end of the millage with 4.75 mills in total towards roads, in addition to their Public Act 51 and federal fuel tax money, and Livonia in and around 1 mill. Federal fuel tax funding is the next thing that I wanted to talk about briefly. As a city, we would compete with the other cities and villages in Wayne counties for our share of federal fuel tax revenues. Not to get too excited about this number, though, it's not a large number in any given year, and for the purposes of our analysis, we have not included it in the numbers. It would go directly into major capital improvements, major reconstructions of the federal aid-eligible roads, which are generally those major mile roads. Since my analysis assumes that most of those major roads would be retained by Wayne County, then that wouldn't be money that Canton would get. That would be money that the county would get for those repairs. The other thing to mention about federal aid is that the projects and amounts vary each year by community. There's a limited pool of this federal money available, and each community has a lot of needs. I think we kind of jokingly say it's about a 35-page list of needs that are out there in any given year that is produced just for the Wayne County communities, primarily broken down by city, village, and then the county projects. So it's a very long list of projects. There's many projects on each page, just so you understand. It's, hundreds and hundreds of major projects that are a high priority, and not enough money to go around to fix those. So for the purposes of this analysis, there's no federal fuel tax revenue included. So, two different scenarios were run. The first scenario is what I call the low range. This is the conservative range in terms of the amount of revenue that Canton could potentially receive under Act 51 as a city. This assumption is that those three transfers that I mentioned from the State General Fund, which are $150, $325, and $600 million a year in the first, actually kind of the second, third, and fourth block a year shown on this table, that those actually don't happen, that Lansing does something legislatively to change Act 51 and not allow that to happen during the next 3 years. So we wanted to make that conservative assumption at the time these numbers were run, because the reality was these numbers, this legislation was still relatively new, and the first transfers are just occurring in this current fiscal year. So you can see when we ran the numbers out in the spreadsheet for the current fiscal year, the state fiscal year that just ended, our population is still based on the 2010 census, which is 90,173, and we would potentially receive about $6.2 million in revenue. Similar amount next year, although it ratchets up a little bit because that $150 million kicks in, plus some additional vehicle registration and gas tax money going into the Michigan Transportation Fund. And then a little more sizable kick in the following year for two reasons. One, again, more money, now $600 million going into the Michigan Transportation Fund, but our population also jumps to 97,000, which is what we're projecting the census to be roughly in 2020. So that $600 million carries forward into 2020, 2021 fiscal year, so the number stays the same. And again, with that same footnote that I mentioned earlier, we changed the assumptions on the 2 miles of major roads and the 208 miles of local roads, and these numbers look totally different, just so the public is aware. So this would be the low range, say roughly $6.2 to $6.8 million a year. The high range scenario assumes that those transfers occur from the State General Fund into the Michigan Transportation Fund at the three numbers I had listed. Again, the past fiscal year, it's still 6.2 because the transfers didn't occur just yet. They occur for the first time in the 18-19 fiscal year. So you can see that flips now to 6.6 million. If you look at this previous slide, it was 6.2 without the transfer occurring. Then the subsequent year jumps to 7.7, and the final year 8.4 for comparison's sake versus 6.7, assuming the transfers do not occur. So on the high range, we're looking at a range of somewhere between $6.2 and $8.5 million in Public Act 51 revenue, with the assumption that 2 miles of major and 208 miles of local roads would be transferred. And just for the board's comfort, I know the board has seen these numbers before, but for the board and public's comfort, these numbers were vetted with the Michigan Department of Transportation individuals who actually certify the calculations, and they confirmed that these estimates were an accurate portrayal of what the numbers would look like based on the assumptions that we provided. And we also ran those by one of our engineering consultants who also basically confirmed that the numbers appear to be correct. So on the revenue side, that's what the picture looks like. The last part of the equation is the expense side. And the expense side, again, we could talk for an hour and a half on this slide alone if you wanted to see all the nitty-gritty details of each line item. But really, this is my estimation, my projection of what it would take to establish a roads maintenance section in our Public Works Division in our department. There's really 5 major components you can see here. The first is a loan on the equipment. You know, pretty clear, we don't have 10 plow trucks. We don't have all the other equipment that's required to operate and maintain a road system like road graders and backhoes and all the, hot patch and cold patch equipment. So we would have to buy that. I've estimated that amount in 2018 dollars to be $4.2 million in capital, and spread over a 10-year loan, that translates to about $538,000 in annual expenses each year. Second line item is staffing. This would be for the 29 full-time equivalent, is what FTE stands for, positions with, salary, benefits, training, uniforms, all the normal stuff that goes into the cost of having people. That number, again, has been vetted against similar numbers in Livonia, Novi, and Farmington Hills, who have, let's just say, generally similar. Novi's a little bit smaller, but we just did some interpolation of Novi's numbers to just confirm that these numbers were not out of line. Third line item is the materials for road maintenance. This includes both summer and winter materials. As you can see, you've got salt and brine in the wintertime, plus fuel for the trucks, and then stone and chloride. Stone is for the gravel roads and other road repairs, and then chloride is for dust control on gravel roads, which we would assume that the county would transfer all the gravel roads to the township. So that's a total of $543,000. We have another $900,000 allocated in here for contracted services. These are, some of these are stormwater-related services, such as sweeping the roads, performing minor patching, tree maintenance, and other kind of minor maintenance activities. And then the final cost in the expense side is the building facility itself. Our Public Works yard does not have a facility of sufficient size to house all this equipment, so I've estimated that it would take about $5.6 million to construct a facility of adequate size to house that operation. Given the life cycle and the likely bond that would be required to build that facility, we anticipated 15 years, so about $500,000 in expense. So roughly $4.4 million in really known costs going forward. This is under a traditional service delivery model where the municipality hires staff and performs the work in-house, as was discussed with the road task force back in April. There are alternative deliveries, models out there, including wholly privatized services, partially privatized services. But for the purposes of this analysis, we kept it simple, and I'm most confident in these numbers. So that's a little bit on the revenues and expenses, and I'll turn it over to Wendy for the last couple slides.
Thanks, Tim. Just a couple of real quick things as far as how our revenue would be impacted. Our current tax structure, as we know it, goes away. So Chris talked about that a little bit, that The charter, our charter cap at this point in time is about 5 mills. As a city, we could be up to 20 mills if that's what the charter were to vote. But the Public Act 33, the public safety levies, the special assessments that we currently have would be eliminated if we became a city. So currently, we have the ability for 10 mills for police and 10 mills for fire. Those go away, and those separate funds and how we account for those also goes away, and those would be absorbed into the general fund. So that would be different for us and how we would operate. Also, the roads millage that just passed in August of 2018 is gone, so we cannot continue to roll that forward if we were to become a city. That would also be eliminated. So just overall, right now, our general operating, we have up to 5 mills, but that has been rolled back to 3.75 for Headley. Currently, we are only assessing 1.366 mills, but we have the capacity at this point, without a vote of the people, to go up to 3.75. And at a city, we can go up to the 20 mills. As I had just spoke, the fire and police special assessment go away. That's up to 10 mills for each of those. Currently, for the fire, we are at 3.858, and police, we are currently at 5.676. So we aren't charging the full 10, but we have that ability to. And we are currently charging 1.45 mills for the roads, which would also go away. So as a township, currently, we actually have the capacity to levy up to 25 mills. We're not there, obviously. And as a city, we are capped at this point in time at 20 mills. So our levying capacity does go down a little bit currently if we were to become a city. I've spoke to bond counsel, and we talked about other potential statutes that would give us different taxing jurisdictions. But obviously, this is not a common occurrence to go from a township to a city. So it takes a lot more research and looking into what it would truly mean. So if that was something the board would like to pursue, it's going to take a lot more work and a lot more digging into what this would truly mean financially, as this has not really been looked into on a regular basis from any attorney or CPAs or whatnot. It's been a long time since it's happened. So, but that's a kind of a general overall tax impact to the township.
Good. I think that concludes our formal presentation. We're now an hour and 40 minutes into discussion, plus the board had another meeting before this meeting. Do we need to take a break, or do we continue to plow forward? We're good? Keep going? Keep going? All right, let's keep going. All right, so now what we're going to do is public comment. If you have questions that you ask that we can answer really, really quick, we'll do that. But if we can't answer that really, really quick, we're going to ask that you send us an email, and we'll get you detailed responses on whatever questions you may have. So what we're going to do is we'll go from the front of the room to the back of the room, end with former Supervisor Phil LaJoy in the back, or we got another gentleman the other behind him as well. So if there's public comment, we would ask that you come to the podium, speak into the microphone, provide your name and address, even though it's not necessary, we request it, and you limit your comments to 3 minutes. And really, this is intended to be public comment. So it's not going to be a discussion or a debate. It's just share with you what you're thinking, and then once all the public comment is completed, then we'll come back with board comments and then close the meeting. That's the plan. And Darian, you're first up in the front row. Would you like to say anything, sir? Or you're not prepared? So, well, there's not going to be a second opportunity. I'm going to go through the room once. Would you like to speak, sir? You're on, yeah.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Gary Otiski, 47596 10 Point Drive, Canton. Resident 41, 42, whatever years, 2 different communities. You know, I've seen this community grow and grow and grow, and we still got the same problems from 1977. And there's recent draft up there, graft, said it was like 12.5 mills we're paying out. We could levy it up to 25 or 20 with no vote. What would be, and a lot of that would be elimination if we become a city, what would be the cost with the elimination, what are the costs as a city? What would the taxpayers pay?
Well, that's absolutely unknown at this time until the
Right.
charter is developed and they decide what the city's going to look like and what kind of services it would provide. At the surface, I mean, it's 20 mils. That's the max. After that, you'd have to go to the vote of the people. So it's unclear at this time.
Yeah, but we need to know what's the actual cost is going to be, because we have to stop the loss of taxes to the taxpayers as the township. You know, this road tax is fine, but when you do the road tax, you get involved with residential, commercial, and industrial tax, then you get double whammy. The stores will start charging more, the restaurants are starting more, the manufacturers start charging more. So we got to continue the growth, but we got to protect our veterans, our senior citizens, and our working personnel in this community. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Parker? Ladies, would you like to speak? Would you like to say anything, ma'am? Okay, next row back. Yeah, please.
Hi, my name is Alice Spuck. I live at 42469 Majestic Court in Canton. I've lived here 42 years, and we've loved most of it. I would like to know if you are able to tell me who initiated this, and also, you see how many people showed up. I felt like it was kind of a secret meeting, and if it wasn't by word of mouth, half of this room wouldn't have been here, which I feel that's kind of, you know, negligent on your part up there, because you're supposed to be taking care of us. Who initiated this, and what do they get out of it?
Absolutely, that's an
Thank
easy
you.
question. Yeah, it's a very simple question. During the Roads Task Force, which were open public meetings, there were several of them, dozens of community members participated. One of the requests that kept coming up to the surface back and over and over and over was, should we become a city, yes or not? Should we or should we not? And I made a promise to that group back months and months ago that we would have this meeting tonight. And this meeting tonight is not a decision, guys, to do or not to do. This is purely, what's it about, what's it going to take? So does that answer your question, ma'am?
Yeah, just kind of secretive.
Okay.
Known this was even happening tonight, if it wasn't in the focus.
Yeah, okay.
Point of order,
Yeah.
Mr. Supervisor, if you're not standing at the microphone, nobody who's watching this meeting that is being recorded will be able to hear audibly what you say, so it will just look a little bit weird for the thousands of people who will be watching this meeting at home. So if you do have something to say, please make sure you're at the podium standing into the microphone.
Ma'am, your point is taken. I understand what you're telling me, and we will always try to do a better job communicating. So, Melissa? Yes, sir, please.
Hi, my name is Bill Slaby. I live at 48720 Hanford Road between Beck and Ridge. I'm on one of those dirt roads that gets plowed every three days after snowfall. I just want to thank you for putting this together. How do you know what the options are unless you look at it and investigate? City, is it better than a township? I've always kind of felt it was, but just continue on. I think you just scratched the surface for me, you know. And some of your financial projections, who knows, what's the charter going to really be? Thank you, thank you, thank you, you know, appreciate it.
Okay, so going back, next row back, sir, and we'll work across, yes? And if something's already been stated, let's not all say the same thing over and over. So we're looking for fresh as we go. Try to keep it crisp for everybody.
Steve Valley. I live at 42440 Saratoga in Canton. Shortly after Governor Snyder took office, he made a proposal that I thought was quite reasonable, that he would like to see a lot of small local government units merged together to reduce their bureaucratic overhead expense. And having lived in Ashtimo Township outside of Kalamazoo, I've noticed that compared to Ashtimo, Canton has all the amenities of a city. But keeping in mind the potential for having a larger city bureaucracy rather than the township bureaucracy, has anyone looked at potentially going in with Plymouth Township or Van Buren Township and forming one city out of 2 or 3 townships. And so we've got the one larger city bureaucracy, but not have 3 separate township bureaucracies.
That is a simple question, is we already do have consortiums where we work with Northfield Township, Plymouth Township, Canton Township, in the wastewater treatment. We're discussing buying water together, but to take a regional approach to roads in dealing with Wayne County, because we all have the same issues and problems, it's been discussed but never formalized. So it's out there as a potential long-term, but nobody is, it's not short-term at all. Sir?
Evening. I'm Dave Bunch, 7073 Copper Creek Circle. I've been in Canton for 39 years. I told Diane Slavens on Sunday I was just going to come listen and not say anything, but I'm coming at this from being a retired project manager and corporate project manager and retired business process consultant. So I have some process questions for our presenters that are specific, assuming we get to the point, we might get to the point of having a charter commission. And my question, probably best for Larry or Kristen, is trying to remember if you said, Larry, if there's any recent examples where a community has already gone through this process, where there's a body of knowledge that can be obtained that would give our potential charter commission some really solid guidance on how to go about it and lessons learned especially, that sort of thing. And probably also kind of speaks to what Kristen was saying in terms of the specific process. So I don't expect an answer, obviously, but I'm just saying that's something that we should be looking at. And I have a second question then, too, as for Wendy, I think probably, as far as budget impacts are concerned, other revenue impacts. At what point would the change be made from the existing revenue structure to the potential revenue structure, the future revenue structure? Would it be on the date that the charter is certified by the Secretary of State, or that's something that we'd have to understand? We would have to understand that. I don't expect an answer on that now, but that's just something to understand. And also related to that, what's the timing in terms of how you determine, what's the lead time that you need, I guess, in order to know what you're going to have in terms of your future revenue and tax structure, so that you know what's going to happen and when it's going to happen. You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, Kristen may or may not have a better answer to that question, because, we'll have to set, the township board, I would imagine, is going to maintain its current structure until the city vote has happened. And so the budgets are going to have to keep going. An elected group is going to have to approve a budget. Kristen, do you have any idea when the tax structure changes?
Well, the city form of government is not official until a charter is adopted by the residents and it's filed with the Secretary of State. So the current tax structure would stay in place, until that is set up through the charter. And then, assuming it would be adopted and filed in time for the upcoming tax levy, it could be as soon as whatever tax bill is coming up next. So that would be my understanding of how it would happen. And
Please.
just to answer your question, and maybe Larry knows more recently, we did some searching. The last community in southeastern Michigan that transferred from a township to a city was Rochester Hills, which was 35 years ago. But it looked like on the chart that Larry had, there may have been 2 more recently.
Nope, those are
the
the
last
Rochester
one.
Hills and Auburn Hills, those are the same ones. However, I do want to mention that my good friends from the Michigan Municipal League do have guidance documents on city charters and samples, right, Bill? And they would be very valuable for you.
A lot of information online through Michigan Municipal League. Okay, ma'am?
Hi. I'm Donna DeMello. I've been here 42 years, and it's at 1403 Rainier. My question is, it's kind of the old-school neighborhood, not the own condo streets. If the city, if it became a city and they were plowing and had their equipment, would that cover our side streets? I wouldn't expect it to cover the condos, right? Because that's private-owned streets. But would they go into our neighborhoods and plow the streets is what I'm wondering down the road. I know you probably can't answer that
Well,
yet,
it could
but,
potentially, yes,
you
potentially,
know,
yes.
Then we wouldn't have to pay for snowplow compared, because we don't
Right.
own our streets.
That's right.
We have nothing mandatory for our associations. So I was wondering.
Yes, correct.
All right, thanks.
Waldecker? Okay. Sir?
I'm Giles Zelkowski, 37-year resident, 3 different communities. Appreciate all the input that's gone into this, very well prepared, and that makes me feel comfortable that we have professionals looking into all this for us. Couple questions, just is there additional funding that's required to go through this whole process, or is that just come out of revenues already generated through taxing, or is there like, oh, we have to study this, we need contracts for this and grants for that, and we need more money to do this whole process? Then being in here 37 years, I don't ever remember this coming up before, but has the township gone through this ever before, and what may or may not have happened from that period of time?
Is that finish? Okay, so in terms of the process, it has nothing to do with these guys sitting up here in general funds until something occurs where the citizens get the petitions to the point where all of a sudden now we've got to engage and respond, and the clerk has to get involved, and commissions have to be created. So then support then would come out of general fund dollars to fund that going forward. In terms of the question, Supervisor LaJoy, this is something I wrote him about for 10 years. I understand much better, sir, today why you responded to me for the last 10 years like you have, but maybe you can attest to, or prior to me being around the last 10 years, was this ever brought to a study session? And I'm sorry to put you on the spot like this, but, yeah.
Long time. It was never done, but there was, one of the finance director of Canton did I think it was a master's thesis or something like that, and did it on Canton becoming a city. And her bottom line was not a good idea. That's
Thank
about
you.
the best that
I appreciate it. So
can
no,
give
there
you.
has never been a formal study session previously. Thank you, sir.
No.
Thank you. All right, please, yeah, go ahead. We'll continue to work our way back here.
Steve Verducci, 806 Huntsville Drive, about 20 years I've been in Canton. Okay, you said you're doing this because somebody asked you to, right?
Was the Roads Commission group, yes, sir.
Okay, so I'm going to be against it, so I'm going to ask you to work for us, I mean, my side also.
Okay. I work for everybody, my friend. Okay, next up. Okay, all right, so we're going to go back to Greg Hohenberger. I'm thinking no. Ma'am? No? Sir, would you like to speak? Ma'am? Okay. Okay, Plant Moran, Alicia, how you doing? Staff members here. Doug, would you like to speak, sir?
Good evening, Doug Adams, 7711 Chichester, 19-year Canton resident. I was a member of the Road Task Force, and what I will recite is data. It's factual, it's substantiated, it's not necessarily my opinion, but in all the discussion we've had thus far, we've had projections. And as somebody who is in commercial finance, we tend to put greater emphasis on historical facts as opposed to projected if come. So if you look back, and this is very accessible on the internet, go to the City of Livonia's website, their budget on pages 5 and 7 of their city budget. You could go back over a 10-year period, Over the course of the past 10 years, fiscal year 2008 through 2017, vis-a-vis predominantly their Public Act 51, because understand, residents of Canton Township, when you pump your gas tax and you pay it, it goes to the state. In turn, that money goes to Wayne County. If you're in the city of Livonia and you're a resident, you pump your gas, that gas tax goes to Act 51 and it goes direct to the state. In fiscal year 2017, as an example, in the budget for the city of Livonia, $8.3 million was given direct from the state of Michigan to the city of Livonia. If you were to look at this 10-year compare and contrast, Livonia versus Canton, why is that relevant? The population is very comparable among the two communities, about a $6,700 different resident difference, and I surmise it will exceed Livonia here with all the residential development going on in the upcoming census. There's 0.2 square miles difference between the two communities. There's about 87 miles difference in public roads, so that's a variant factor. But long and short of it, in the last 10 years, between the local millage that Livonia has had in place and with Canton, we have been underfunded to the tune of $61 million, 60.94 to be exact. And my data for Canton comes from having been a member of the road task force, as well as Bernard Parker III, and Pat, you were copied on an email back in February of 2018 when we corroborated Canton's data. And I'm telling you, the transparency, I guess I could sum her up, and Pat, believe it or not, there's an acronym, and the acronym is PAT, as far as it relates to roads in that regards. And in that, I would say, P for that acronym, predictability. If you're a city, you have much more predictable funding source vis-a-vis the way Act 51 set up. A, accountability. We live in Sunflower, and to see road construction in front of Tonda School commence right before school started, I have a hard time believing that would have happened had the roads been controlled by Canton Township as opposed to the arbitrary whims of Wayne County. And then T, transparency. If you go to the City of Livonia website, it is black and white. It tells you what they're projected to do for the roads for this fiscal year and into the next fiscal year. So just a complete coincidence, Pat, that those sum up the distinctions between the two. But I'm sure there's other members of the road task force that have additional comments that they might like to throw in as well. So I will conclude with this. This is on the website. So our road task force, one of my colleagues here came up with what we call the ownership principle. And it simply states, this is our collective road task force. In the interest of first principles, it's a recommendation of this roads task force that Canton community take ownership of their roads. Embracing this would form the foundation from which a long-term program for restoration and maintenance of our roads would be developed. And with that, I conclude. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Okay. Three minutes, well done.
Good evening. I'm Jim Castillo, 1015 Northridge Road. And as having served as the chairperson of the Roads Task Force, I just want to express on the behalf of the membership the appreciation to the Township Board for conducting this evening's session to give a very thorough and detailed and thoughtful presentation regarding the different options and opportunities that each form of government presents. So thank you very much for following up on one of the task force recommendations and pursuing this evaluation session this evening. I think it doesn't take a great deal of wizardry to come to the recognition that what we're really talking about here, the only reason for the consideration of any change of form of government has to do with potentially bringing more dollars into the community for the purpose of addressing roads. That's what the change of form of government would bring with its associated Act 51 revenues. The staff has done a very good and thorough analysis of what some of those estimated revenues would be, as well as what some of those estimated costs would be, utilizing a series of assumptions and utilizing things such as a traditional delivery system. I think that if the community wants to aggressively pursue exploring bringing more revenue into the community for the purpose of having that revenue address itself to roads, then that's where you're going to have to study a little bit further. challenge some of those assumptions, look at different delivery systems models, look at the costs of delivery of facilities and personnel for road construction, road maintenance types of operations. If those assumptions look true and ring true, given a long-term perspective, then you can accept those assumptions and move ahead. But if different assumptions, different cost estimations would bring you some different results, then it begins to make sense to continue on with the exploration of how you might be able to bring more revenues into the Canton community for the purposes of roads. That's really, in essence, what we're talking about. All the other services, Canton currently levies about 13.85 mills, if I'm not mistaken, for the police and fire, the roads, the variety of services. All of those same services, can be provided with under the statutory provisions of the Home Rule Cities Act. And so we're really only talking about the distinction of what a city and Act 51 brings to the community for roads. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so, ma'am? Okay. Would you like to speak, Tony? Okay, gentlemen would like it? Nope, okay, so now we're to the back road. Mr. Stroop, sir, would you like to speak? No, 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 no. No. Supervisor? No, sir? Thank you. Okay, back row. Oh, oh, oh. Let's speak. Okay. Well done, guys. Oh, sir, Mr. Ron, would you like to speak? Please. Okay, please. Oh, would not? He's good. Okay, all right. All right. Again, well done, guys. We got through it. We did it. Yeah, okay. So now, board comments. Go ahead, Summer.
I will start us off. I was the board representative on the roads task force, so I heard a lot of this conversation about becoming a city. Spent about 9 months, I think, on that task force. And as we went through the process of educating community members about the roads millage, a lot of people brought up the prospect of becoming a city. I do have a couple of questions. The roads task force identified a need of about $230 million in road spending that we needed in this township. But we're not alone in that. Over this year, there were 235 roads millages on the ballot this year, spread across cities, townships, and even county-wide millages. There are structural deficiencies in how we fund roads in this state. And if we were to become a city, would any of those challenges go away? Would any of those structural deficiencies go away? Would that solve all of our problems? Would we be able to meet our $230 million need for road fixes?
So if you recall, one of the meetings of the Roads Task Force, I had presented kind of an alternative version of what the task force was, the task force was kind of gaining consensus on, which was about a 6 mil millage in order to solve that $200-some million problem. I had presented an alternative at about 3 mills that would solve the $200 million problem over a 20-year period. And what the board ultimately decided to put before the voters was 1.45 mills, which generates about $112 million over the 20-year period. So, the reality is it's about half the amount I think that it would take to fix the issues. The question is really, is more than 20 years going to be needed? Is 20 years enough? And we're really not going to know the answer to that question until, probably 10 plus years down the road. But I guess I would contend, based on what I know and based on the discussions with other communities that we had while the materials were being prepared for the task force, that we're probably funding the very minimum that would be required with the 1.45 mills to tackle the problem.
You said that the last townships to become cities were Rochester Hills and Auburn Hills, and if memory serves, it took quite a few years for that to happen. I think in one case it was like 13 years. Am I remembering that correctly?
I can't validate
Okay.
that. I came in on the tail end.
Okay.
Yeah, I think the City of Rochester Hills website has quite a history about its challenges in the transition from Avon Township to Rochester Hills, and anyone can go there and look up that information. There was a lot of litigation, a lot of difficulty, but it's all kind of laid out on the township, or on the, city website.
As they were going through that process, did they know at that time how the roads were going to be divided between jurisdiction of the county and jurisdiction of the city, or did that happen after they'd gone through that 13-year process?
Yeah, we don't know.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I think this was asked when Dave Bunch asked a question, but just to clarify, as you're going through the process of incorporating, we're still governed under the Charter Township Act? And
Yes,
Okay.
until the point you would get a charter on the ballot. You might remember I said if the charter fails, but there's officers that are on the ballot, whoever's the highest vote getter becomes the de facto mayor and would hold that position either until a charter is adopted and a mayor was elected, or the third charter fails or the 3-year time period expires and you revert back to a township.
thank you. Thank you all for presenting tonight. There was a lot of good information.
Yes, thank you. It was really understandable, and it really helped clarify some things in my mind for me. I just had 4 questions that I thought of while you all were presenting. What is the time frame to gather the petitions, if that were to be done?
I don't think there is one.
No, it can
You
be
wouldn't-
done over 10
You wouldn't
years,
submit
or-
it to the Boundary Commission until you had the requisite signatures. And once it gets submitted, that sort of sets off the time limits for the public hearing and all that kind of stuff.
And then for the different ballot questions, can those be called in elections at any time, or are there certain times that they have to be called?
The statutes don't specify it, they just say the clerk shall call an election. I suspect for cost reasons, they're going to likely try to put them on, already scheduled primary or general elections, which could be another reason why the process would drag out. There's nothing that requires the calling of a special meeting.
So in terms of township versus city, we talked a lot about roads, and that under a city, we would take over some of the roads. Are there other responsibilities that we would take over from the county? Not a roads type thing, but anything else that would be required?
The county, not really.
Okay.
And especially in a community like Canton where we have public utilities already in place, we have public safety, police and fire already in place. There's lots of townships throughout the state that wouldn't already offer those services that would have to, come up with additional funding, not just for the roads, but also to offer those services.
No, I think that accurately summarizes it.
And then lastly was just a question, Tim, for you. The charts that you were showing showed the population increase in 1920, but why would that occur if the census hadn't been completed until 2020?
Yeah, it's just based on the fact that the state fiscal year overlaps the time at which the census is, completed and then ultimately certified. So we just made an assumption that the 2020 population would hit during, or the 2020 population increase would hit during that fiscal year of 1920.
Oh, okay. The 2020 census getting done before the first half of I forget, what's the fiscal year for the?
Goes through the end of
It does go all
September.
I was thinking July. Okay, thank you. I'm good, thank you.
Just a couple quick comments, and I want to thank everybody for coming to this
study session. I think it's real important. It's good to see our citizens are engaged. And the Roads Task Force had requested this, so I want to thank everybody for presenting it. It was an excellent presentation, very informative. My only comment is I did pull up, well, one question would be, for the millage rate, if we were to become a city, you know, as the treasurer, we have to collect the taxes. When would the board decide what the millage rate would be? Because we would have to have that ready and set to go well before the December 1. How would that?
The charter process, the charter commission could say, or could, you know, put in the charter a max amount of mills that the city could levy, or they could just say up to the max 20 mills, and then it would be up to the council to set the millage rate on an annual basis.
And then the only other comment I wanted to make was I did do, I looked at the millages in the surrounding cities, and we are much lower, even in Livonia. And a lot of their revenue, a lot of their millages are from commercial and industrial. We have more residential than they do. So I just wanted to make that comment that that would be a big concern I would have, is our millage rates would be much higher than they are now. Thank you.
Kind of keying off of one of Steve's comments, when the charter group comes together, it's not just about roads, guys. It's what that new charter, how it's written, and what's permissible that could be included by that charter group that gets elected to define. All of a sudden, the scope gets much broader, and that explains why a lot of the surrounding cities have higher tax rates, and I think it all ties together. Gentlemen, Larry, Chris, to have two gentlemen of your caliber come into a community and spend a night like you have a week before Christmas is amazing. Thank you from the, heart and soul for you guys coming out tonight and doing this for us. It's absolutely wonderful. Thank you.
I have a couple of questions, thank you. And again, thank you to everyone who presented. Wendy, what is the existing operational millage for Canton Township if you include the roads millage right now? 12.3?
12.35.
Okay, I thought I had heard somebody say it was 13 at some point.
It's
but
12.35.
12.35. Okay, that's what I had written down, and I know that for Livonia, it's 13.9 mils, which I guess if we had their tax rate, I would be paying an additional 1.55 mils, which is about an extra $171 a year, but who's counting, right? Yeah, I've got a lot of questions about this. The road funding model we had talked about, I believe, was predicated on us receiving just about 2 miles. However, did that have us receiving all of the Act 51 funds for major roads that the county currently receives, or no?
It does not, no. I think I have that figure here, if you could bear with me. Yeah, I don't have it right here, but the county receives, I think it's about 1.3 million more, so my 6.2 plus 1.3 is about 7.5 million, is roughly what they would receive in this past fiscal year from Act 51 for Canton roads. It's difficult to kind of see it because all the roads in the county are computed with one set of numbers. There's not a specific number from the state for Act 51 for Wayne County, but you can use the spreadsheet and get close.
Okay. If we didn't get any of the miles of major roads, what would that funding model look like?
It would drop substantially because we would not receive the population component of the major roads, and population factors into both the major road calculation in the spreadsheet and in the local road calculation.
What would be significant?
Yeah, it's
$2 million?
certainly more than $1 million.
More than $1 million.
Yeah, because again, as I mentioned, the majority of the money goes into the revenue. The majority of the money comes to the major roads, not the local roads. It's about a factor of 3 roughly.
Okay. Yeah, because that's my curiosity is, I guess we're hoping that the county doesn't notice that we're going to take 2 miles of the 58 miles, lane miles of major roads, and a substantial portion of the money from them. And I know if someone were trying to do that to the Canton Township, I would catch that very quickly. And I would probably have something to say about that, especially if the county is then responsible for the remainder of the roads, the remaining 56.74 miles of county roads.
Found it.
You found it?
Found it. So I'm not crazy.
Good.
Thought I had it. It's about 4 million in
Four?
total. Yeah.
So of the 6
6
million, 4 is for major roads, of which we
Right.
would be getting 2
So
out of 58 miles.
Right, assuming we had 0 major roads from Wayne County, it would cut the 6.2 million by 4 million roughly.
Interesting. And so let's say we get the $4 million from Wayne County, and we don't get Morton Taylor Road, we don't get Sheldon Road, we don't get Warren Road, we don't get, well, we do. They give us the dirt road part of Warren, right?
Yep.
Interesting. I noticed a pattern with the roads we would be receiving in that model.
Yep.
We don't get Morton Taylor, we don't get Cherry Hill, we don't get Lilly, all of the roads I hear people complain about. We don't have jurisdiction over. We don't get to service them or maintain them or fix them. That's an interesting notion.
As I mentioned, the assumptions change a lot
Sure.
with the numbers. So until you go through the negotiation, you don't know what that final equation is going to look like. We made some assumptions based on what we think are operational decisions.
Yeah.
Kind of how roads would get plowed, how roads would get maintained. And, the reality is it's probably going to be somewhere in between. It's possible the county could take the position that they'd give us all the roads. I personally think that's unlikely because they'd be giving up a lot of revenue.
And we would be inheriting a $230 million problem with not $230 million worth of revenue. That would be interesting, too. Yeah, okay. Let's see, what else did I kind of had some questions about as well. I know one of the interesting things that the city of Novi did, I know it was very controversial. We just had the local roads millage, but the city of Novi, because they're a city, put their road millage in the charter so that it has no expiration date. I had heard some people initially were concerned our millage was a 20-year millage. In the city of Novi, they will be having that millage until they decide to vote it out of their charter, which is an interesting provision that flexibility that a city allows you to have, can have. Yeah, I was initially taken aback when I started hearing that the recommendation potentially could come out of the roads task force for 6 million mills of additional tax, additional tax. I could not afford that. I was glad to see it drop down to 3 mills, and then when we settled with what I thought was a little more palatable of the 1.45 mills, a little bit more manageable for individuals. So when I think about this, so clearly there would have to be a petition, and I guess the question would be, if I look at the surrounding city tax rates and what I've seen consistently over and over again, and even in Livonia, the smallest taxing of the cities in Wayne County, I see we would be looking at what a reasonable person would say, an almost guaranteed tax increase if we were to become a city. So potentially, we're going to see a tax increase. And we don't necessarily know what the obligation we would be inheriting is. We don't necessarily know what the legal liability for those roads might be. And we're hoping that the county either doesn't realize that we're going to be picking their pocket of some $4 million, or that we enter into good faith negotiations with them. Well, a promise from the county, an unknown liability and an unknown obligation at the same time that you're going to raise my taxes. Boy, I don't know if I would sign that petition. That's all.
John?
I kind of like Canton Township. I like the way it is. I've been here since '73, raised a family. It's a great place. It's a great place to live, work, play. Yeah, there are other options. Do you think Act 51 is going to stay Act 51 forever? A young lady to my right here is in engineering, and she says we're all going to be driving driverless cars or calling up Uber or whoever the hell one of those is and have somebody else drive you around. So I'm not sure that pot of gold that we think is out there at Act 51 is going to be there much longer. And I guarantee you, I'll bet my federal pension on the fact that if you go to a city, your millage rate's going to go up to 15 or 18. Guaranteed it's going to. Look around these other communities. Yeah, I like my friendly banker over there. I don't know if you brought any money with you tonight for us, but make a very good point. We have been cheated over the years on that money. But I don't think Canton's done all that bad. When you look at everything else, the roads are driving us nuts. The new governor says she's going to fix the damn roads. Okay, let's see what she does. Is that going to impact? Are we going to go down the road to a city, and then all of a sudden the federal government's going to dump money into the infrastructure, and the governor's going to dump money into it? And holy cow! Now we've gone down this road, which is very complicated, very complicated. And then we get down to the end. What the hell happened? Where's all that money coming from, or not coming from? So I don't know. I like Canton Township the way it is. You'd have to really sell me on changing the structure. I like the fact that the board here is right in touch with the community. We know what's going on. We know what your needs and wants are, and what you like and what you don't like. You get to a city, I don't know what the heck that's all about. I don't like that structure. I like Canton the way it is.
Thank you, John. Anne Marie?
No,
Thank you, John.
don't quit. Thank you. Thank you very much for the presentations. They were very informative. Even though we've heard it a lot, I always learn something every time we talk about this. And for the young lady, if you look in the focus or on the website, you can always find out what meetings are coming up, or even call into the township if you can't, and they'll let you know what the agendas are. And a lot of the questions have been asked that I had. So basically, Livonia, we're looking at 13.9. I'm assuming Novi and Farmington Hills have even higher mill rates. Do we know what the benchmark of that is?
I could get that for you.
Okay.
I've looked at it in the past.
Okay. And basically, as Pat said, you can send emails with more detailed questions. And, we're talking about roads, but as John also said, this is a bigger picture. It's not just, you don't want to just become a city because of roads. It is a bigger picture. It's a way of life. It's a culture. And do we want to change that? So I like the questions that have been asked. I thank everybody for coming. And you guys, as you were asking questions, I don't need to ask that, but thank you very much. But thanks for coming, and have a good night. Thank you.
Michael, one more point.
Oh, yeah, I just have a quick point I didn't think to talk about, because I'm also doing double duty. As we learned, I am the clerk and a member of the board, right, because we are a township. But city clerks do death certificates and birth certificates, so there would be an expansion of the scope. Additionally, Livonia does their elections in off years, so does Westland. So just an interesting tidbit, Westland has 61,000 registered voters. Canton Township has 67,000 registered voters, just a few more. Their mayoral race in 2017 had 6,700 people voting for mayor. So that's interesting. 6,700 people out of 61,000 voters voted for mayor. In the supervisor's race, I believe there were like 43,000 people in Canton Township who voted in that race in 2016. So there's the additional cost of running an election in an odd year, and there's the fact that there's less participation in selecting who our local leaders are. And as was interesting comment tonight about what happens when people feel like there's secrecy or they don't know, like they're in touch with their local leaders. Interesting points.
Okay, I'm going to wrap up with Merry Christmas, Happy New Year. I call for a motion to close the meeting.
So moved.
Support.
No, sir. No, absolutely not. But you and I can talk for another 20 minutes out in the parking lot.
There's a motion on the floor, Mr. Supervisor.
What's the next step?
Thank you. Actually, that's a damn good question. I've completed my commitment to the Roads Task Force. This conversation is now back to the people of Canton Township, period. It doesn't belong up here. So that is the next step, sir. Again, call for a motion to close.
Been moved and seconded.
Those in favor of the motion, say aye.
Aye.
Motion carries. Meeting's adjourned. And guys, I will talk to anybody out in the hallway that wants to talk.